Rainwater still ran from the hem of Susan Fraser's mantle when she stepped down from the coaching cart into Covent Garden at dawn, and the cold hit her legs through wool so thin it had forgotten how to warm. The market was already awake. Carts rattled over stones slick with night rain. Fishwives shouted prices into steam rising from horsebacks. A butcher's boy laughed while he hauled a crate past her shoulder, and did not look twice at the way she flinched from the contact, because she was balancing a basket of breakfast pastries on palms blistered open from lye and hot water. Lady Fraser had sent her ahead with instructions given in that mild voice that always drew blood without raising itself. She was to run before the family carriage, enter Halwick House by the servants' door, carry what she was given, speak to no one unless spoken to, and remain out of sight once the first bell rang. Susan moved through the crush with her head bowed and her eyes lifted, watching every wheel rut and elbow and hanging sign, because a stumble would cost more than skin. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Hunger made her hearing too sharp. Every sound struck like metal. Her dark hair had been pinned in haste under the cart canopy, and the rain had loosened it, so damp strands clung to her neck and cheek. Her shoes, once black kid, had split at both toes and took in water with each step until each stocking squelched softly inside, leather gone soft as pulp. Men in good coats passed her with folded newspapers and smelled of tobacco and clean linen. Women with fur muffs stepped around her basket as if she were another puddle to be avoided. She was 22 and carried silver sugar tongs wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the basket, because even when she bore silver, she bore it as if she had stolen it. No one saw a solicitor's daughter crossing the market before sun-up. They saw a plain, narrow girl in a mended dress moving quickly enough to suggest she belonged to someone else. By the time she reached the square where Halwick House stood, the rain had thinned to a mist that hung in the air and settled on stone railings like breath on glass. 2 footmen were polishing the brass knockers at the main entrance. They glanced once at her basket and then away, the practised blindness of men whose wages depended on noticing rank and nothing else. Susan turned down the side lane to the servants' passage, skirt brushing wet brick, shoulder scraping a wall darkened by smoke and age. Inside, kitchen heat met her face and turned the cold on her skin to ache. Copper pots rang. Knives struck boards in fast, clean rhythm. A scullery maid took the basket from her, without thanks and without cruelty, merely in haste, then pushed a stack of breakfast plates into her arms before she could flex her fingers closed again. The skin across her knuckles had cracked from laundering linen through the night. Now each plate edge pressed into the splits as if testing them. She crossed the back corridor 3 times. She climbed the narrow stairs twice. On the second landing she paused because a black veil of dizziness came down for one breath and then lifted, leaving her with the taste of iron at the back of her tongue. She kept moving. The house had rules measured in footsteps and bells. At the first bell, coffee to the blue parlour. At the second, hot water to the small breakfast room. At the third, no maid in sight unless summoned by name. She knew every turn and threshold because she had been made to learn them when she was 16, and her father still lived upstairs in the study, coughing into a handkerchief while dictating clauses she copied in a neat legal hand. He had once praised that hand. Now it was the same hand that scrubbed cuffs and wrung napkins and carried trays for guests who spoke of law and contracts, while never wondering who had stitched the loose button at the Duke's chair or polished the silver at his right hand. When the breakfast corridor was laid, she took her position in the narrow shadow between the sideboard and the tall clock, where servants stood invisible until called forward by a nod. The corridor smelled of coffee, beeswax, and wet wool drying by hidden fires. Her stomach tightened at the scent of bread. She had passed 5 baskets of rolls and touched none, not from virtue, from arithmetic. A missing roll would be counted. A missing girl could be replaced. On the wall opposite, gilt mirrors threw back a bright room. She was not permitted to enter except at speed, chin down, feet silent. At this hour gentlemen arrived in dark coats and winter cravats, carrying dispatch cases tied with ribbon and seals, heavy as coins. They set gloves on tables and spoke of votes, grain prices, militia appointments, the weather over Portsmouth roads. They did not lower voices for her because they had no reason to believe she understood what they said. Lady Fraser had cultivated that belief with care. Too plain to marry, too weak for society, useful with accounts, but not with guests. The line had been repeated often enough at cards and luncheons that it passed for fact. Susan had stood near enough to hear her own life rendered as nuisance, and once, when she had looked up at the wrong moment, one of Lady Fraser's friends had smiled and asked whether the girl read at all, as one asked whether a hound could fetch. She had answered, "When required, ma'am," and the women had laughed as if she had attempted wit. Ink still stained 2 fingers of her left hand from the ledgers she copied by candlelight after midnight. Columns of figures Lady Fraser called household necessity and locked away before dawn. Susan knew those figures too well. Interest upon interest. Notes renewed, then renewed again. Sums written beside her own name with her own family seal, pressed into wax that was never set before her. The seal had belonged to her father. So had the ring that bore it. She had not seen the ring in 11 months. At 7:30 the house shifted into that brittle quiet which came when rank moved near. She felt it first through the floorboards, heavier steps in the front hall, the soft stamp and jingle of bridles in the mews beyond the courtyard. A porter hurried past with fresh coals and nearly struck her shoulder, muttered apology when he recognised no one of consequence, and continued at once. Susan adjusted the coffee service on the silver tray and steadied the cups with 2 fingers so they did not rattle against saucers. Steam dampened her face. Heat stung the raw places at the base of her thumbs. She had slept less than 2 hours. The night rain had driven through loose panes in the attic corridor where she sorted sheets, and twice she had gone down to the laundry hearth to relight damp kindling because Lady Fraser had ordered fresh linen for this breakfast, council, and fresh linen did not wait for weather. On the final trip back up the servants' stair, she had stopped by Martha's door with a folded blanket over one arm. Martha had coughed in her sleep, a low, deep cough that ended with a silence too long, then a fragile breath. Old nurse, old loyalty, old bones. If Lady Fraser dismissed her today, no other house would hire her. Susan had said as much 2 nights ago and been answered with a smile that smelled of rose water. Then had come the command to run ahead with pastries and sealed papers tucked beneath the basket cloth, to deliver 1 packet to the Duke's secretary before noon, and return to the corridor before anyone asked why she had gone. The order had been spoken like kindness. It was not kindness. It was a threat disguised as duty. She felt the packet now against her ribs where she had tucked it for safety when the market crowd pressed too close, stiff edges scraping skin each time she breathed. Wax had softened from her body heat and then cooled again, leaving a faint medicinal scent of resin and paper. She did not know all that the addenda claimed. She knew enough to fear them. Names were wrong. Dates had shifted. 1 witness line was left blank for filling later. Her father had taught her that legal falsehood was rarely loud. It moved in a margin, 1 altered numeral at a time, until a house belonged to the wrong hands and no one remembered exactly when it changed. She remained by the clock while the minute hand climbed toward 8, eyes lowered whenever a gentleman crossed the threshold, and raised only long enough to see what mattered. Which chair was taken, which portfolio opened, which expression tightened at a mention of debt. Through the half-open panel she heard Lady Fraser's laugh, warm as cream in public, followed by the rustle of costly silk as she crossed to greet arriving guests. She wore lavender this morning. Susan knew it without looking. Lavender in spring meant she expected sympathy. Lavender in winter meant she expected victory. A footman leaned in and told the butler, in a whisper meant for no one, and heard by everyone in service, that the Duke of Rathbourne's carriage had turned into the square. Susan's spine went rigid under wet wool. She had seen the Duke only once before, at a distance, black coat against rain, profile hard as carved stone, a scar drawing one corner of his mouth when he spoke. Men like him decided whether disputed claims were heard at all. Men like him could sign a letter that gave a widow 6 weeks or 6 hours. She shifted the tray from aching left palm to aching right and felt skin tear anew beneath the handle. The clock struck the quarter. Somewhere beyond the corridor a child laughed once, then was hushed. In the kitchen below someone dropped a ladle and cursed softly. Above all of it came the precise grind of carriage wheels slowing on wet stone at Halewick House, and Susan understood with terrible clarity that if the packet did not reach the correct hands before noon, Martha would be put into the street before evening prayers, and no one in this house would call it cruelty. The sound of those wheels pulled old numbers to the surface of Susan's mind the way rain drew ink through cheap paper. Halewick House had not always smelled of polish and restraint. When her father was alive, the corridors had smelled of paper, lamp smoke, and wool cloaks drying by the hearth after clients came in from wet roads. Men had sat in the front room with boots muddy from farms 2 counties over. Women had arrived with cracked hands and marriage settlements folded in aprons. Her father had listened before he spoke. He had a low voice, patient and exact, and he had kept one hand at the small of Susan's back when he walked her past shelves of reports and statutes. As if she was something precious he was determined not to misplace in his own crowded life. He had taught her to sharpen quills and blot signatures and align folded deeds, so seals sat cleanly over joins. He had laughed once when she caught a copied date that did not match the original grant, and called her his sharp-eyed clerk, while Martha pretended to scold him for making a child work. That world had narrowed by inches. First came the cough, then came the physician, then the physician came daily. Her father worked through all of it, breath fraying, hands shaking, only when he thought she looked away, and he died in early winter with legal briefs stacked at his bedside and his fingers stained blue from ink that had dried before he could close the file. Within 3 days, clients stopped calling at dusk. Within 6, locked drawers were opened by other hands. Within 2 weeks, Lady Fraser stood in his library with a tally sheet and sold volume by volume to collectors who praised the bindings and did not ask who had annotated the margins in a precise, slanting hand now gone forever. Blackstone first, then equity reports, then the older Scottish treatises he loved for their arguments on stewardship and trust. Susan had carried those books downstairs herself because refusal meant punishment and delay meant accusation. She still remembered the weight of each crate against bruised forearms, remembered the way her breath shook when she handed over a volume containing her father's note to her in the flyleaf, her initials hidden in a corner no buyer would notice until long after the door shut. By Candlemas, the shelves were thin. By Lent, they were ornamental. Leather spines arranged for display and not for use. A library turned into a stage set for callers who admired taste and never asked what had been erased to pay for it. Lady Fraser had entered Susan's life years earlier, With silks and gentility and promises about household stability, after Susan's mother had been dead long enough for other women to say the word practical in tones meant to sound kind. Susan had been 14 then, still tall and all elbows, still foolish enough to believe that civility and affection were cousins. Lady Fraser kissed her forehead in church porches and called her dear child before witnesses. In private, she measured everything. She measured candles. She measured bread. She measured the length of Susan's sleeves against her own daughter's gowns and decided who would inherit warmth. By the first month after the funeral, she had altered sleeping arrangements, so Susan moved to a colder upper chamber because the lower room, she said, was needed for trousseau storage. By the second, she had reassigned every maid who had served Susan's mother and replaced them with girls loyal to her purse. By the third, she had begun the small humiliations that left no mark anyone chose to call a wound. A breakfast tray passed over Susan with the words, "Miss Fraser rises too late to merit eggs," though Susan had been awake since before dawn blacking grates. A shawl mislaid in wet weather, and found only when mildew had spotted it through. Invitations written for Miss Clara and Miss Imogen Fraser, while Susan's name stayed off every card, as if she had become a cousin too poor to acknowledge. Clara and Imogen learned quickly. They copied their mother's smile and sharpened it. Clara took Susan's mother's pearl comb and wore it to assemblies as if inheritance had settled by nature. Imogen asked for Susan's blue walking dress, then laughed before friends that it hung badly on narrow shoulders and must have been cut for a servant. Susan had answered little. Answering gave Lady Fraser material. Silence denied her that pleasure, though it never protected Susan from labour. She mended lace she was forbidden to wear. She ironed ribbons she would never touch in public. She stitched torn hems after midnight so her stepsisters could dance until 2 and return to wardrobes already restored. When she failed to please, Lady Fraser did not shout. She used witnesses. "Our Susan is useful with rough work," she would say in drawing rooms bright with candlelight. "One cannot expect polish where there was so little maternal guidance." The women who heard would tilt their heads in sympathy toward Lady Fraser, not Susan. They did not know Susan could pass a trust deed faster than either daughter could read a prayer. They did not know because Lady Fraser had spent 6 years ensuring knowledge and voice were kept separate inside this house. Debt did what overt cruelty could not. It gave Lady Fraser a language society respected. Bills arrived tied in ribbon and were discussed over tea like weather, temporary strain, liquidity, a bridge between seasons. Susan copied every figure because she was told her hand was neat and clerks were expensive. The first ledgers were merely strained. The second set concealed transfers from one account to another, sums shifted at month's end, then shifted back 2 days later to disguise deficits. The third set named Susan directly, dower reserve against future settlement, then drew loans against that reserve with clauses so dense that only someone trained to distrust generosity would see the trap. Her father had left a modest dowry in trust, not grand, but sufficient for independent life, if managed with care. Lady Fraser treated it as unsecured coin. She borrowed against it to settle gaming notes for Clara's husband. She borrowed against it to refurbish the town drawing room before receiving season. She borrowed against it again to cover interest on the first borrowing, then called the entire arrangement domestic necessity in front of guests who nodded because they admired her composure. The family seal made each paper look respectable. Susan had searched for that ring for nearly a year. Once she had found wax drippings on Lady Fraser's escritoire and a scrap bearing half the impression. Once she had seen Imogen slip a sealed envelope into a reticule with shaking fingers and ink still wet. Once she had asked carefully whether any solicitor had reviewed the renewal notes, and Lady Fraser had answered with a backhand strike so quick and precise that only Martha saw it, then ordered Susan to fetch more tea before visitors noticed. "Do not perform martyrdom in my parlour," she had said, when Susan's cheek flushed. "You are fed, clothed, and sheltered above your value." Martha had pressed cool linen to Susan's face afterward, and said nothing, because old servants knew the arithmetic of survival too. Yet even Martha could not stop the newest threat. 2 nights ago, Lady Fraser had stood at Susan's attic door with lavender on her wrists and rain behind her, smiling as if granting favour. She had handed Susan the breakfast instructions and the sealed addenda. "You will place these before His Grace's secretary before noon," she had said. "You will not read what does not concern you. If you fail me, Martha will leave this house by dusk. I will not pay sentiment to keep useless age." Then she had closed the door softly, as if politeness made extortion lawful. Now, in the corridor outside the breakfast room, all of that lived in Susan's body as immediate weight rather than memory. Her shoulders burned from carrying trays and crates and books that should never have left the house. Her fingers shook not from girlish nerves, but from cold, hunger, and sleepless labour stretched across too many months. Under her bodice, the packet edges scraped each breath, reminding her that forged words could exile the only person who had ever loved her without condition after her father died. Through the panel she heard chairs drawn back, then the low register of men who expected law to obey their signatures. The butler moved past her and gave a tiny coded signal with his hand. "Stand ready!" She lowered her gaze. The tall clock ticked. Coffee scent thickened. Somewhere in the rear passage Martha coughed again, a dry sound swallowed quickly, as if even illness needed permission in this house. Susan steadied the tray and forced her breathing to match the pendulum. She could not afford fear that scattered thought. Her father had trained her better. Observe first. Move second. Speak only when words could alter outcome. She counted what remained, hers. One clear memory of where a witness line had been left, blank. One nurse whose pension could still be secured if the right magistrate saw the right page in time. One mind no one in silk had managed to blunt. Beyond the threshold, a servant announced the Duke of Rathbourne in a voice that carried down polished corridors like a formal warning. Boots crossed marble. A chair at the head of the table shifted. Susan felt the house reassemble itself around rank. She stepped from the shadow with the coffee service balanced on torn palms, and the old life of paper, seals, and truth rose in her chest like a held breath finally forced toward speech. The breakfast room doors opened on a wash of heat and silver light, and Susan crossed the threshold with the coffee service steady in both hands, while her wet shoes left dark half-moons on parquet polished to a mirror. The room was larger than her memory had made it. Windows rose 2 stories to the cornice and threw back a pale morning that made every spoon and crystal edge shine. 12 men sat at table, black coats, white cravats, papers arrayed beside untouched eggs and kidneys. Their voices had the low, clipped cadence of people who governed places they would never see. At the head sat the Duke of Rathbourne. He had removed his gloves and laid them beside a portfolio tied in blue ribbon. His hair was dark as ink, cut close in military style. His shoulders seemed built for armour rather than cloth. The scar she remembered from rain and distance drew from the left corner of his mouth toward his cheekbone, a pale, narrow line that sharpened his expression even in stillness. He did not look up when she entered. He listened while a heavy man on his right discussed corn tariffs in Sussex and tapped one finger on the table in silent measure. Susan kept her gaze lowered and moved behind chairs with the careful pace of someone walking between loaded firearms. One misstep, one cup overturned, one glance held too long. She set a cup by the Foreign Secretary's hand, then another by the Under-Secretary beside him. The pot was heavy. Steam dampened her face. Her palms burned where old blisters had reopened. She counted placements, as her father had taught her to count signatures. 1, 2, 3. Do not skip. Do not repeat. Do not draw notice. She was 3 chairs from the Duke when a folded dispatch slid from the elbow of the gentleman nearest the sideboard and struck the floor. He cursed softly and bent. His shoulder caught the tray edge. Porcelain clinked. The coffee pot lurched. Susan shifted her grip fast enough to save it from shattering, but hot coffee sloshed over the spout and across her wrist. Pain bit to the bone. A white cup toppled, rolled, and came to rest against the Duke's boot. Silence struck the room so hard it felt physical. The gentleman who had knocked the tray drew back at once and looked not at Susan, but at the Duke, waiting to discover whether this was inconvenience or offence. Susan set the pot down before her shaking hand could betray her, knelt to retrieve the cup, and saw, at the edge of her vision, the packet under her bodice shift, loose from the pressure of bending. She pressed one forearm against her ribs to hold it in place and rose with the cup in both hands, coffee dripping from her wrist to the cuff of her dress. Her breath caught once. She mastered it. The butler moved from the wall to take the damaged cup and replace it. The Duke lifted his gaze then, not to the spill but to her face. His eyes were a storm blue grey that did not soften when they settled. He took in the wet strands of hair at her temples, the torn cuff, the stain on her sleeve, the rigid set of her shoulders, and then the flattened shape hidden beneath her bodice seam. Recognition did not show. Assessment did. His voice when it came was not loud, and because it was not loud, every man heard it. "Remove her! I do not dine with petitioners!" The words landed with surgical neatness. No temper, no explanation. Pure dismissal, public and absolute. Heat flooded Susan's face in a rush that felt like fever. She had endured insults in drawing rooms and stairwells and laundries. But this was different because it was spoken before men whose signatures could keep or ruin households. Men who would remember the sentence as if it were fact rather than convenience. Petitioner, as if she had pushed through polished doors to beg coin. As if the ink on her hands meant greed and not labour. The butler did not hesitate. He touched her sleeve in the smallest gesture and angled his head toward the service door. Susan should have obeyed in silence. She knew the rules. She knew the punishment for speaking out of turn to rank. Yet the clock in the corridor had just struck 1/4, and the command from Lady Fraser had not altered because a duke chose contempt. Before the butler could guide her away, she lifted her chin the slightest degree and addressed the table's lower end, where the Duke's secretary sat with a ledger open. "Mr. Hale, sir, there is a packet for your hand before noon." Several faces turned. One minister frowned as if a chair had spoken. Mr. Hale half rose, uncertain whether to answer a servant in the Duke's presence. The Duke's gaze did not leave Susan. "She has been instructed poorly," he said to no one in particular. "She mistakes this room for a vestibule." Susan swallowed once. "Your Grace, it concerns Fraser Instruments already before your office." A rustle at the doorway announced lavender before silk. Lady Fraser entered with a smile arranged for men of consequence, one gloved hand resting on the arm of Miss Imogen, who looked at Susan and then away with practised distaste. Lady Fraser gave a small laugh, bright as cut glass. "My apologies, gentlemen. My stepdaughter confuses duty with performance when she is overtired. Susan, leave at once. You are not called." The lie was smooth enough to pass in most rooms. This room watched rank, and Lady Fraser's rank was sufficient. Susan felt the packet edge bite her skin where wax pressed through muslin. If she withdrew now, Lady Fraser would intercept her in the corridor, and the papers would vanish before noon. Martha's door would be opened by dusk. She did not look at Lady Fraser. She kept her eyes on Mr. Hale because papers had no pity, and therefore could still be trusted. "Sir, I was ordered to place this in your hand." Lady Fraser's smile thinned by a fraction. "Ordered by me to the servants' office not to interrupt His Grace's breakfast with theatrics." The Duke leaned back an inch. The scar at his mouth tightened. He looked from Lady Fraser to Susan and back again, taking the measure of both versions without comment. Then he held out his hand toward Mr. Hale, and the secretary passed him the nearest page from the open ledger. The Duke read one line, set it down, and spoke without lifting his voice. "Mrs. Fraser, your papers have already consumed 3 mornings this month. If there is another amendment, it will wait until proper hour and proper channel." Lady Fraser bowed her head with perfect deference. "As your Grace commands." Susan's pulse hammered so hard she heard it in her ears. Proper channel by noon, or Martha on the street. She tasted iron again. She could not say that aloud. To expose the threat would expose Martha's frailty and invite Lady Fraser's retaliation before this table dispersed. She made one final attempt, each word clean and formal, as if reciting statute. "Your Grace, the witness line is incomplete." Mr. Hale inhaled sharply. Lady Fraser turned to Susan with a look that promised private ruin. The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened to winter. "You have exceeded yourself," he said. The butler stepped closer. Susan's shoulders went rigid under his guiding touch. She moved then, because staying would become spectacle, and spectacle would kill whatever chance remained. She turned toward the service door with her head high enough to keep her vision clear. Behind her, cutlery resumed its faint, controlled music. Conversation returned in fragments about Ireland, shipping, appointments. The machinery of power repaired itself in seconds. As she reached the threshold, the Duke spoke again, this time to his secretary. "See that no unauthorized paper from Halewick House reaches my desk without verification." The sentence sounded administrative. It was a wall. Susan passed through the service door before her face broke and stood in the dim side corridor, where the smell of coffee gave way to coal ash and damp stone. Her hand shook so violently she had to brace it against the wall. The packet under her bodice felt suddenly heavier than ledgers, heavier than wet laundry, heavier than every law volume she had carried down from her father's library. Behind her, from the breakfast room, came one low burst of male laughter at some remark she did not hear. She pressed her bitten lip between her teeth until the sting cleared her sight. "Martha! Noon! Move!" She crossed the corridor, descended 2 flights, and nearly collided with the undercook, carrying a tureen. He muttered and sidestepped. No one else stopped her. In the back passage, she slipped through the scullery door into the courtyard, where rain had left shallow pools between cobbles, and the morning wind sliced straight through her wet mantle. Carriages stood nose to tail by the mews wall, harness leather dark with damp, breath streaming from horses in white plumes. A groom led one chestnut mare in circles, boots striking water with flat slaps. Susan kept to the shadow of the carriage block and drew out the packet at last. The seal impressed into the wax was her father's crest, badly struck, but unmistakable. Lady Fraser had used it again. Susan stared at the distorted impression and felt, beneath fear, a hard line of anger settle into place. He had taught her that false instruments survived only while no one read them closely. She would get this to Mr. Hale another way if she had to wait by his carriage wheel and force him to take it in full view of every coachman in the square. She tucked the packet back beneath her bodice and stepped around the rear of the Rathbourne coach, seeking the side gate that opened toward the clerk's entrance on Linton Street. A sound stopped her. Not loud, a compact, sickening thud, followed by the scrape of wood against stone from behind the stacked crates near the far wall, where the carriages cast deep shade and no one was stationed. She froze for one heartbeat, listening. No groom called out. No footman answered. Then a child's breath came ragged from the shadow, and Susan was already moving toward it, skirts catching on splintered crate slats. All thought of humiliation burned away by the old immediate instinct that had always ruled her fastest decisions. Someone was hurt. She rounded the stack of crates and found a small body crumpled in the narrow strip between a carriage wheel and the wall. One boot twisted beneath a fallen shaft of oak, one hand braced in mud as if he had tried to stand and failed. Blood had run from a cut at his temple and dried in a dark line through fair hair. His breath came in hard, thin pulls. He could not have been more than 8. He saw her and drew himself tighter at once, jaw set in a way that did not belong to a child. "Do not touch me." The words were breathless and proud. They were also afraid. Susan dropped to her knees in the water beside him, skirts soaking through in a moment. "I shall touch only what keeps you from greater harm." He flinched when she reached toward the timber, pinning his leg. She stopped before contact and let him see both her empty hands. "Look at me," she said, low and steady. "Tell me where it is worst." He swallowed. His eyes were grey like storm water, too bright with pain. "My head is nothing. My ankle." He tried to pull free and cried out despite himself, the sound cut short by clenched teeth. She shifted closer and studied the angle. The broken crate slat had dropped with the carriage shaft and trapped his lower leg against stone. Not crushed, not yet swollen beyond reason. There was room if she lifted the wood and drew his boot straight back. Alone she would have one attempt. If she failed, she would do worse than the fall had done. Behind her the yard went on with ordinary noise. Harness chain, a groom swearing at a stubborn buckle, hooves striking wet cobbles. No one looked into this corner. "Listen to me," she said. "I shall count to 3. When I lift, you pull your leg toward me. Do not twist. Straight toward my hand." His mouth trembled once and stilled. "If you drop it—" "I shall not." He stared at her face as if deciding whether plain girls in wet mantles could be trusted with life and bone. Then he gave one short nod. Susan wedged her shoulder beneath the slanted timber and set both palms against the rough edge. The wood bit into torn skin. She ignored it. 1, 2, 3. She drove upward with her legs and back, felt the shaft rise an inch, then 2. The boy dragged his trapped leg free in a scraping jerk and collapsed against the wheel, gasping. The timber slammed down and splashed mud over them both. Susan sat back hard, breath burning, arms shaking from the lift. The child clutched his ankle with both hands. His face had gone white beneath the rain and dirt. "It is broken!" "Perhaps, perhaps not." She moved his hands gently aside. "I must see." His stocking had already tightened over swelling at the outer joint. When she touched above the bone, he hissed and shut his eyes. When she touched his shin, he opened them and watched her with fierce attention, waiting for the verdict like a man at sentence. "Not the long bone," she murmured. "That is mercy. The joint has turned." He gave a small angry laugh that dissolved into a shiver. "You speak like Mr. Penrith." "I speak like someone who has seen stable lads fall from haylofts." That was true. In her father's last winter, when money thinned and physicians were too dear, Martha had shown Susan how to bind sprains and splint wrists with kindling and linen. Hold the limb. Still the panic. Keep the person breathing slow enough to think. She had not expected those lessons to matter in a ducal muse. The cut at his temple was shallow, but still seeping where rain had softened the clotted edge. Susan glanced at her own dress, measured what could be spared, and gripped the torn hem of her petticoat near the ankle. She ripped a long strip free. Fabric gave with a harsh sound that seemed too loud for the corner. The boy stared. "You shall be whipped for that." "Likely." She folded the cloth into a pad. "Turn your head." He obeyed, after a beat. She pressed the linen to his temple and tied it behind his ear, careful of wet hair and small flinches he tried to hide. His breathing eased by 1 degree. "Now the ankle," she said. "I can stand." "No!" His eyes flashed at the command, offended. "I am not a baby, and I am not arguing." She looked around for splintwood, found 2 narrow crate slats, half split at one end, and snapped the ragged edges against the cobble until they were smooth enough not to tear skin. "Give me your hand." He hesitated, then placed his hand in hers. His fingers were icy. "Good. Keep looking at me. Tell me what horse you rode this morning." He blinked, thrown by the question. "Argent." "The grey with the scar on his neck." "He throws everyone else." "Then he has judgment." She set 1 slat to either side of his ankle and wrapped another strip of torn cloth around both, binding snugly but not crushing. "What happened?" He stared past her shoulder toward the lane. Shame moved through his face like shadow. "I did not wish to sit in the nursery while they talked. I went to the mews to climb into father's curricle. The step was wet. I fell." He said it flatly with effort. Children of his rank were trained early to fear humiliation more than pain. "No one saw?" she asked. "I did not call out." Of course he had not. Pride ran through him like iron wire. So did loneliness. There had been a laugh in the house earlier, quickly hushed. There had also been silence around his place at breakfast. Susan looped the last knot and tested the splint with her fingertips. Firm. She slid 1 hand behind his back so he could lean without pressing the injured leg. He was trembling now in waves that followed pain's first sharpness. "Shall I die?" he asked suddenly, the words small and formal and very young. Her throat tightened before she could master it. "No." "Are you certain?" "I am certain." He swallowed hard and turned his face away as if embarrassed by relief. Rain slid from his lashes. She had no blanket, no coat to spare. She drew him closer by instinct, folding him against her shoulder to keep his shivering from worsening the injury. Mud soaked through both their sleeves. From the far side of the yard came a man's voice, raised with controlled urgency. "Master Rathbone!" Another answered farther off. "Not in the stable, your grace." The boy went rigid. "Do not tell him." Susan looked down at him. "He is searching." "He shall lock me in the schoolroom." The child's jaw shook once, not from cold this time. "He shall dismiss Hawkes for losing me. He dismisses everyone." There it was. Not fear of punishment for himself, but fear that his mistake would cost someone else their bread. The sentence sounded too practised to be a guess. She smoothed wet hair back from his brow with the side of her hand. "Then we tell him the truth quickly and in order. You climbed. You slipped. No one pushed you. No one neglected you." His eyes searched hers for mockery and found none. "You would say that?" "Yes." Even as she said it, she knew the danger. If she was found kneeling in mud with the Duke's injured son while forged papers sat hidden against her ribs, Lady Fraser would make a weapon of every appearance. Servant girl, scheming, dramatic, always where she should not be. The old accusations would arrive dressed as concern. She could walk away now. She could leave the boy propped by the wheel and return to her own crisis before noon swallowed it whole. She tightened her arm around him instead. A small sound escaped him, almost a sob, quickly bitten back. He drew one sleeve across his eyes in an awkward swipe, and then looked furious with himself. "I am not crying. I did not say you were." He took a breath, then another. "Who are you?" "Susan Fraser." He frowned faintly, fitting the name to some overheard room where adults spoke too freely around children they considered furniture. "Fraser, the debt woman." Heat touched Susan's face despite the cold rain. "Her stepdaughter." Understanding shifted in his expression. "Not complete. Enough." He looked at her torn cuff, her raw knuckles, the ink stains still faint on the side of her thumb where lye had not scrubbed them out. "They sent you to work breakfast in that dress?" he asked. "They sent me to carry what was needed." He studied her one moment longer, and then gave a grave nod as if acknowledging an unkindness he had no power to mend. "Argent likes sugar crust from currant buns. Cook says it rots his teeth." "Cook is correct." His mouth moved, not quite a smile, gone in an instant. The rain thinned to mist. Sound in the yard sharpened. Bootsteps approached from the archway and stopped. Susan did not turn. She was tying the final securing strip below the splint and listening to the child's breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale, too fast still. "Match me," she said softly. "Breathe with me." He did. Badly at first. She counted for him under her breath. In for 4, hold for 2, out for 6. When his shoulders began to lower, she shifted to the old Highland lullaby her father used on nights when fever shook him and he pretended not to need comfort. The words were in a language the London house mocked as provincial. She sang anyway, low and even, the melody plain as thread. The boy stared at her in surprise, then let his head rest against her shoulder with the complete trust of exhaustion. She did not see the figure in the archway. She heard only the yard silence around him, the way grooms fell still without being told. She mistook it for weather. By the time the church bell over St. Martin's struck 8:30, she had wrapped the ankle twice more for stability, checked the temple bandage for fresh bleeding, and worked mud from the child's palm, where splinters had lodged. One small shard remained in the heel of his hand, too deep to pull without a needle. She noted it and left it. Better a splinter than torn flesh in a yard corner. He lifted his head when the bell ended. "I am cold." "I know. My father shall be angry." "Your father may choose anger after he chooses a surgeon." He gave a weak, offended snort at the order hidden in the sentence. Then he nodded because pain had stripped argument down to honesty. "If he dismisses Hawkes, I shall run again." "You shall not run on that ankle for a week." He looked appalled. "A week? At least." "Cruel woman, accurate woman." His lashes lowered. "Do not leave before he comes." The plea was quiet enough that she might have pretended she misheard. She did not. "I shall remain until you are handed to him." From the archway, a voice came at last, low, controlled, near enough to cut through rain without force. "Do not move him yet." Susan turned then, one hand still braced at the child's back, and saw the Duke of Rathbourne standing 3 paces away, in the mews shadow, coat dark with damp, hat gone, eyes fixed not on her face but on the splinted ankle, the blood-streaked linen at his son's temple, the torn strips cut from her hem, the mud on her knees, the raw, shaking hands that held the boy steady, as if she had been trained for nothing else. For one suspended second she forgot the sting in her hands, and the packet pressing against her ribs. The Duke stood in the rain-dark archway, as if carved into it, broad shoulders filling the stone frame, water beading on his coat and running from the ends of his hair. He had come without hat or gloves. He had come fast. She saw that in the mud on his boots and in the hard lift of his chest, breath not yet settled. His son twisted toward him at once. Pride returned like armour, thin but determined. "Father, I am well." The Duke did not answer the boy. His gaze stayed on Susan's hands. Torn knuckles, coffee burn blistering over her wrist. Mud worked into the split skin at the heel of her palm. Then to the ripped hem she had turned into bandages. Then to the child's ankle, held straight by crate slats and tied cloth, clean knots set with practical precision. When he spoke, the words were clipped and level. "Where is the surgeon?" A groom startled as if struck from sleep and ran toward the stable gate. The Duke took one step forward, then stopped again. Stillness settled over him with visible force, as though movement itself had become dangerous if unmeasured. Susan had seen men of rank command rooms by volume. He commanded this yard by restraint. The boy reached for her sleeve before she could shift away. "Do not let him send Hawks off. It was not Hawks. I climbed." The Duke's eyes flicked finally to his son's face. Something moved under the cold surface. Not softness, recognition. "You will speak when spoken to," he said. The child flinched, then set his jaw. "Yes, father." Susan felt him trembling again against her shoulder, not from the ankle now, from the command. She adjusted her hold, keeping his injured leg braced and his weight off the splint. The Duke saw the adjustment. His jaw tightened where the scar pulled at his mouth. "Can he be moved?" he asked. The question was for her, not a footman, not a groom. Her. "Yes, Your Grace," Susan said. Her voice came rough from cold and from the lullaby. She cleared it. "Not standing. He needs to be carried flat through the hip with the ankle supported. There is a splinter deep in his palm. It may wait until he is warm." The Duke watched her another breath, as if weighing every word for vanity or error. He found neither. He dropped to one knee in the mud without looking at the ground, coat soaking through at once, and held out his arms to the boy. The child froze. "I can walk." "No." One word, granite and care in the same shape. The boy swallowed and let his father lift him. Even then the Duke did not take him quickly. He slid one arm behind the child's shoulders, one beneath his knees, paused while Susan steadied the splinted ankle in both hands, and only then gathered him close. The movement was practised in war, perhaps, or in grief. He did not jostle the injury by a fraction. The child made a small sound and gripped his father's cravat. The Duke's chin lowered to the damp crown of his son's head for a moment so brief it might have been balance. It was not balance. Susan rose from the mud too fast. The yard tilted. Black edged her sight. She reached for the carriage wheel and caught it before she fell. Her wet skirt dragged at her legs like lead. The Duke turned his head sharply. "Sit down!" It was another command. She obeyed before she could decide otherwise, lowering herself to the nearest crate because her knees had begun to shake in violent, ungovernable waves. The boy watched her from his father's arms, grey eyes wide. "She is the one who fixed it," he said. "She told me to breathe like this." He demonstrated raggedly. "In for 4, hold for 2, out for 6. The Duke's gaze returned to Susan, not to her face, to her chest rising too quickly, then to her bitten lower lip, then to the coffee burn blistering white at the edge of red skin. "You burned your wrist in the breakfast room," he said. It was not a question. The words stopped her more effectively than if he had seized her shoulder. She had not spoken of the spill. No one in the yard could have seen it. "Yes, Your Grace." "You were dismissed before you could deliver whatever paper you carried." The packet seemed to throb against her ribs. She held his gaze because lowering it would read as deceit. "Yes, Your Grace." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet you came to the mews instead of the street." "I heard him fall." A pause. Rain ticked from the carriage roof. Somewhere beyond the arch a horse stamped and rattled harness metal. In that small enclosure the world had contracted to whetstone breath, and the distance between his scrutiny and her refusal to flinch under it. "Name," he said. "My lord." "Your full name." "Susan Margaret Fraser." A strange expression crossed his face and vanished. "Fraser?" He looked toward the archway where 2 footmen hovered uncertainly, then back to her, then to his son. "Who was with you?" "No one." "No one sent you here?" She understood too late what he asked. Not location, intent. Whether she had used the child's injury as theatre after the breakfast humiliation. Shame flashed hot and immediate. Anger followed it, colder. "No one sent me to find your son beneath a carriage shaft." His mouth moved once, not a smile, something like surprise at her edge. "Good," he said, and the word held like a struck bell. "Keep that tone for people who deserve it." The child stirred in his arms, drowsy and shivering. "Father, do not scold her." "I am not scolding her." He adjusted his hold minutely, sheltering the bandaged temple from drizzle with his own shoulder. He did not seem aware he had done it. Susan noticed because she noticed everything when fear sharpened her. By the second bell of 9 from the church beyond the square, the surgeon's trap had not yet turned into the lane, and the cold had begun to settle deeper into bone. The Duke looked toward the house. "Blankets!" he snapped at the waiting footman. "Hot bricks! The blue withdrawing-room fire! Now!" The men ran. His son pressed his face into his coat and whispered, "Do not let Lady Fraser in." Susan heard it. So did the Duke. The line between his brows deepened, but he gave no immediate answer. He looked back at Susan, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in him, brief and controlled, like a blade's flash before it vanished under cloth. "She touched you?" he asked his son. "No." "Did she speak to you today?" "No, she never speaks if father is near." The Duke's jaw hardened. He shifted his weight as if to stand, then stilled again when the boy winced. His attention snapped to the injury, total and immediate. He remained kneeling in the mud rather than risk a careless rise. Susan saw his hands then. They were steady where they supported the child, not steady at the fingers near the wrist. A tremor, fine and fast, that came and went with each exhale. Cold might have caused it. Fear might have. She could not know. She could only see it. He caught her seeing. For one beat, neither looked away. "You bound this with petticoat linen," he said. "Yes." "You set the joint with crate slats?" "Yes." "You sang to regulate his breathing?" She nodded, throat suddenly tight. "What did you sing?" "A Highland lullaby, Your Grace." "Why that one?" Because her father had sung it through blood in a handkerchief. Because Martha had hummed it when fever took her mother. Because children listened to old tunes when commands failed. She did not trust herself with that truth in this yard. "It has a slow measure." He accepted the answer, or he set aside the rest for later. His eyes dropped once more to her hands. "You are hurt," he said, each word distinct. "Your hands are split. You were sent here hungry." The brutal directness of it struck deeper than his breakfast dismissal. No one said such things aloud in houses like this. Suffering was either ignored or translated into etiquette, He named it without ornament, and the naming felt like exposure and relief at once. "I am fit to stand," she said, because she did not know what else to do with being seen. "Liar!" The word was quiet, final. Heat rose to her face despite the cold. She opened her mouth to deny it, and could not. Her teeth had begun to chatter so hard that denial would have sounded absurd. The footmen returned with blankets, steaming bricks wrapped in flannel, and a maid carrying scissors and clean lint. The Duke gave 3 instructions in rapid succession, each precise. "Wrap his shoulders first, not the ankle. Keep pressure at the temple, lightly. Send Hawkes to me, immediately. He is not dismissed." The last line made the boy go still with relief so sudden it looked like pain. He closed his eyes and exhaled against his father's chest. Susan felt something in her own body loosen, then tighten again as the packet reminded her of noon. "Mr. Hale," the forged addenda. "Martha." She pushed to her feet, swaying once, and steadied. "Your Grace, I must go." His head turned slowly. "No." "I must place documents before your secretary before noon." "Those documents can wait." "They cannot." He held her with his gaze long enough that the servants around them pretended blindness and looked elsewhere. When he spoke again, his voice dropped, lower than command, yet carrying farther. "You will not leave this yard alone." The sentence landed with the weight of decree, not social courtesy. Protection overt and public, spoken before witnesses who would repeat it by luncheon in every pantry and passage, from Hallowig House to Whitehall. She felt the danger in that protection at once. Lady Fraser would rage. Society would speculate. Her own position, already precarious, could fracture under the attention. Yet she also saw the boy's bandaged head against black wool, the mud on the Duke's knee where he had knelt beside his son without hesitation. The tremor he had not concealed quickly enough. "If I delay," she said, forcing steadiness into each word, "an innocent woman loses her home tonight." Something sharpened in his expression, not scepticism this time, calculation. "Who?" "Martha Davies, my father's nurse." He absorbed that. Rain ran from the angle of his cheekbone to his collar and vanished beneath soaked cloth. He did not wipe it away. "Mr. Hale will come to the withdrawing room," he said. "You will place your papers in his hand there, in my presence." She stared. The offer solved the corridor trap at once. It also bound her testimony to his authority in a way that could not be undone. "You would permit that?" "I would require it." He rose then, in one controlled motion, son in his arms, and for the first time his full height closed the space between them. Even exhausted, even soaked, she felt the force of him like weather. From the rear door came the unmistakable rustle of lavender silk moving quickly over stone. The Duke heard it and did not turn. His eyes stayed on Susan. "Come inside," he said. One beat passed, another. "Now!" Susan moved. Lady Fraser swept into the passage at the same moment, lavender and silk and winter diamonds at her throat, breath quick from haste and fury, sharpened into a smile for servants who watched. She reached for Susan's arm as if reclaiming property. The Duke shifted his son higher against his chest and spoke without looking at her. "Do not touch her." Lady Fraser stopped as if a wire had gone taut through her spine. "Your Grace, this is a family matter. The girl is overwrought. She has a habit of dramatics when she is corrected." The boy turned his face into his father's coat and said, muffled but clear, "She saved me." The Duke crossed the threshold into the house. Susan followed, wet skirts whispering over stone, while 2 footmen fell in behind at a distance that looked ceremonial and felt like guard. Lady Fraser came after them with controlled steps, still smiling at anyone who could be useful. The blue withdrawing room had already been opened and built hot. Firelight struck gilt frames and blue silk walls. The surgeon arrived before the clock marked 10:15, hands red from the cold, spectacles fogged from rain. The Duke laid his son on a chaise and did not leave the room while the temple cut was cleaned, the splinter eased from the small palm with a needle, and the ankle reset and bound with proper splints. When the child cried out, the Duke's hands closed on the back of a chair until the knuckles blanched, but he did not interfere. Susan stood near the hearth with a hot brick wrapped in flannel against her own shaking fingers, and answered every clinical question the surgeon asked with exact times, exact movements, exact symptoms. "No loss of consciousness," she said. "He spoke clearly throughout. He was nauseated once, then settled. The pain in the ankle worsened with rotation, not direct pressure above the joint." The surgeon gave her a brief, startled look over the rims of his spectacles. "That is accurate, miss." The Duke heard it. His eyes met hers, then shifted to the burn on her wrist. When the child had been dosed for pain and tucked in warmed blankets, he caught Susan's sleeve. "You said 1 week." "At least one," she said. He tried for dignity through exhaustion. "You are severe." "Recover quickly and I may revise." His mouth twitched once before sleep pulled him under. The Duke remained still until he was certain the boy's breathing had deepened. Then he turned to the doorway. "Hale." "Mr." Hale entered with ledger, blotter and portable writing case, followed by a clerk from the outer office. Lady Fraser moved forward at once, voice dipped in injury. "Your Grace, I must insist this scene end. Miss Fraser has stolen household documents and, in confusion, attached herself to your son's accident for advantage." Susan felt heat rise, then forced it down. She did not speak. The Duke held out his hand to Susan. "The packet." She drew the folded instruments from within her bodice and placed them on his palm. The softened wax bore her father's crest, uneven and blurred. He passed the packet to Mr. Hale without breaking seal. "Open it! Read aloud every line!" Lady Fraser's breath caught once. "These are private household renewals." Mr. Hale slit wax with a penknife, unfolded pages, and began. By the second paragraph his cadence changed. By the third he stopped. "The witness attestation is blank," he said quietly. "The collateral schedule names Miss Fraser's dower reserve. The seal impression is irregular." Susan lifted her chin. "I said as much at breakfast, sir." Lady Fraser turned on her. "You insolent child, you're fed out of charity and dare lecture men about law." The Duke's voice cut across hers. "Enough!" He looked back to Susan. "You mentioned a second document." Her pulse thudded. She nodded and accepted the small scissors from the maid who had brought lint. In full view of the room, she cut 3 careful stitches from the inside seam of her bodice lining and drew out a folded, oil-wrapped paper, gone soft at the creases from years against skin. She had carried it since her father's final winter, because Martha had told her where he hid it and when to reveal it, only when silence became surrender. She handed it to Mr. Hale. "Codicil to my father's will, executed before 2 witnesses. It names my dowry trusts separately and restricts any guardian from borrowing against principal." "Mr." Hale read, then read again. "Witnessed by Martha Davies and Jonathan Penrith, clerk of Gray's Inn, now deceased. Signature matches known samples." Lady Fraser laughed too quickly. "A forgery sewn by a desperate girl." The Duke extended his signet ring to Mr. Hale. "Compare the hand with Fraser instruments in our files. Send for a runner to Chancery Records now." A footman was already at the door. "At once, Your Grace." By 10:30, a reply came back from the court copyist's office, breathless and ink-smeared, codicil registered, abstract available, language consistent. The blank witness line on the new debt addendum stood alone like an open wound on the page. The Duke faced Lady Fraser fully for the first time since she entered. "You will accompany us to the magistrate." She drew herself up. "I am a lady." "Then you will appreciate due process." The magistrate's chamber on Linton Street smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and old paper. Clerks sat high on stools behind rails, worn smooth by decades of elbows. 2 constables took station by the side wall. Susan stood at the long table with Mr. Hale to her right and the Duke to her left. His presence, a wall she had not asked for and could not deny. Lady Fraser stood opposite in lavender silk that seemed suddenly too bright for that grey room. The magistrate, a narrow man with tired eyes, reviewed the packet first, then the codicil, then the preliminary note from Chancery. He asked Susan to account for the morning in sequence. She gave it in order: breakfast service, dismissal, mews, the child's fall, the binding, the handover. She did not mention any lapse in supervision. She did not use the boy's fear as leverage. When asked whether the Duke's household had endangered the child, she answered, "No, sir, it was an accident." Lady Fraser made a contemptuous sound. "Hear her! She protects power while inventing abuse at home." Susan turned to her then, voice low and clear. "I invent nothing. You borrowed against funds you could not lawfully touch." Lady Fraser stepped forward with her hand lifted, not quite a strike and not far from one. The Duke moved between them in a single motion. "Stop! Miss Fraser stands under my protection, and every debt instrument signed in her name is void pending criminal inquiry." The room went silent, except for the scratch of a clerk's pen racing to keep pace. The magistrate stared at the Duke, then nodded once to the constables. "Seize Mrs. Fraser's account books and seal her household escritoire until audit. Retrieve any signet bearing the Fraser crest." Lady Fraser's composure cracked at last. "You cannot strip me on one girl's word." "On documents," the magistrate said, "and on yours." By noon, the first inventory from Halwick House had returned. In Lady Fraser's locked dispatch box, beneath calling cards and receipted milliner's bills, lay the missing Fraser signet ring, wrapped in a child's glove. The clerk set it on the table. Susan looked at it and felt, for one disorienting beat, her father's study return in scent and light. Martha arrived just after, breath short, shawl pinned crooked from haste. She gave witness to the codicil in a steady voice that shook only when she met Susan's eyes. The magistrate accepted her statement, ordered immediate transfer of Miss Fraser's guardianship petition to Chancery, and directed interim disbursement from the recovered trust, independent residence funds for Susan, wages in arrears, and a pension annuity for Martha Davies paid from the estate pending final judgment. Lady Fraser sank into her chair as if silk could hold her upright by itself. No one looked at her for rescue. Outside, church bells began to mark the hour. One strike, then another. The winter sky had broken to a thin, cold brightness over the square. Clerks carried copies in sand-dusted folders to waiting messengers. Mr. Hale placed the original codicil in a leather case and held it out to Susan. "Where shall this be kept, miss?" She looked at Martha. "With me." The Duke dismissed the carriage and chose to walk them the short distance to the temporary lodging office himself, coat unbuttoned, gloves still unworn. At the door he stopped and turned to Susan. His face was unreadable except for the scar pulling faintly at one corner of his mouth. "You are free now to refuse me," he said. "Will you accept a formal courtship when the court has completed transfer?" It was not a flourish. It was a question stripped to its bone. The clock over the square struck 1 as she answered, "Yes, Your Grace." He held her gaze for a long breath, then inclined his head with grave precision, as if receiving a verdict that altered law. Martha's hand found Susan's sleeve and tightened once. Behind them, a clerk shut the magistrate's door, and the sound carried down the stone passage like a seal set clean on a finished page.